I just was going back and forth with somebody in the comments on a previous episode, and she was basically like, leave that racial stuff away from Africa. We do not define ourselves as Black. We are not Black. And I'm like, this might shock you based on the imaging that is put out into the world about Africans. Black is a label that was put on us by outsiders. Some people have a certain level of entitlement that Americans may find problematic. It might surprise you to know that Africans can be quite classist. This is a generalization that is generally true. Africans are complex, they're multi-layered. There is so much beyond what you see. Welcome to BLAXIT to Africa. I am Tadre Delora Moinier, a California native living my best life in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for coming along for the ride. I hope that you are informed, entertained, and inspired to BLAXIT to Africa. I got a special one for you today, the real truth about Africans. And for my Africans watching, I know you like, we know ourselves. Listen. I know that you know yourselves. However, let me just remind you of the purpose of BLAXIT to Africa. The purpose of BLAXIT to Africa is to encourage people of African descent to return to the motherland. Let me just say that I'm going to make a ton of generalizations. And honestly, I hate to make generalizations, but for the sake of arguments, these will be generalizations. As I said, there's the purpose, and there are people who are coming to Africa for the first time, who have probably never encountered Africans, who have very limited experience with Africans, and I want them to be prepared. For example, I got off a call yesterday. Y'all know I do consultations for people who want to BLAXIT, and sis has had it up to here with the U.S. Lots of folks is just trying to escape. One of the places that people are trying to escape to is Africa. I want people to be prepared. So my Africans, my people that are very familiar with Africans, just bear with us for a moment. In my mind, I'm trying to think like, what is the average North American's perception of Africans? And I'm thinking it's probably some sort of amalgamation between Coming to America by Eddie Murphy, The Gods Must Be Crazy, Poverty, Famine. Then you got Tyler, you got Lupita Nyong'o, you've got the famous ball players from Africa in basketball, football, extremes. I think that the North American, or more specifically, the American idea of an African is one of extremes, really depending upon where you grew up. I grew up in Southern California in the late 80s, right? 70s, early 70s to late 80s. So I did not meet an African that self-identified as African until I was a college student. And that would have been my professor, who is from Malawi. Folks who grew up on the East Coast, I think they have a little bit more experience with Africans, folks that grew up in Texas, and even nowadays, LA, we have the second largest population of Ethiopians outside of Ethiopia. Or is it the first? Yes, the first, and then the second would be Washington, D.C. So let's jump into it. First thing that you need to know about Africans, the average middle to upper class African is more well-traveled than the average North American. Is that a shocker? There's tons of reasons for this. However, I'll give you a few. One of those reasons is that people have been seeking economic, financial stability, employment opportunities, academic opportunities. And over the span of, several decades, you'll find that the average middle to upper class African has loved ones around the world. And so they travel to see those loved ones. I know with my homegirl, her grandmother, basically she travels around the world throughout the year, and she spends a specific amount of time with each child, with her grandchildren in Europe, in the Americas. For some people, they have loved ones in Australia, Australasia. Like, they are very well traveled. And also, I would say more curious about the world, more familiar with the world, especially people who are upper class that have the means to travel. Oh, baby, they gonna travel on holiday. Upper class Africans actually shop for their home accoutrements, their furnishings abroad. The average middle to upper class African travels to neighboring countries just because, for business, for weddings, for holiday. Number two, they know more about you than you know about them. Media. In the same way that African Americans know more about white Americans than white Americans know about African Americans, because the media is saturated with images and stories of Americans, with images and stories of non-Africans. So they know way more about us than we know about them. Africans have an extremely eclectic taste in music. One of the things that used to baffle me when I was much younger, particularly my first trip to Africa at the age of 18 in Zimbabwe, was how they love country music. And back then, this was before Beyonce, okay? Back then, I associated, or dare I say, we associated country music with the oppressor, with the Confederate flag. And in reality, that was our music. We created that music, and Beyonce has helped to remind us of that. And so I would wonder out loud and ask questions like, why do y'all listen to country music? And the answer was, well, they tell stories, and the pace is slow enough to where we can understand and we can sing along. Africans listen to all types of genres without the threat of somebody snatching a black card. You know what I'm talking about. Africans are very industrious. Tell me why my housekeeper, who probably between myself and her other clients probably gets paid about 500 shillings per day. That is washing clothes, that is cleaning houses, that is cooking food for people, that is shopping for people. This is customary in this part of the world. I do pay more, but I know the going rate is 500 shillings per day. This woman comes to me and says, oh, I bought land. Ma'am, how you buy some land? Industrious. Okay, I ain't got no land. I've been here for quite a bit of time. Ain't bought no land. Very industrious people will sacrifice now to play later. One thing that may surprise you about Africans is that they don't view white people in the same way that Black Americans do, in the same way that Caribbeans do. They just don't, even though the history is very similar. Colonization, enslavement, very similar situations. Howsoever, they don't view white folks the same way we do. The below the surface conflict that exists between white Americans and Black Americans doesn't really exist between Africans, Black Africans for the sake of argument, or Indigenous Africans, if that is more appropriate for you, Indigenous Africans and Europeans. Now, there's definitely some underlying conflict between Indigenous Africans and the descendants of settlers, white settlers. There's that. There's conflict between Indigenous Africans and Asian Africans, or Africans of Asian descent. There is that there, but just put it out there. There's nuance, okay? Now, this might be a little controversial, but I'm going to say it because I've noticed it. The average middle to upper class African parent does not parent actively daily. This doesn't mean that they're not parents 24/7, but they're not actively parenting daily. Why is this? Because the babies is in boarding school, okay? They get the phone calls. They talk to their children, they interact, they go visit them on weekends. The kids come home for holidays, they send care packages. But the day-to-day, actively parenting, negotiating, shuffling kids off to soccer practice and what have you, fixing dinner, lunch, breakfast every day, the average African parent, middle to upper class, is not doing all that on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to tell you, Africans are more informed about international politics, news, and history than the average American. Shout out to, what was his name? Dominique down the street at my local petrol station who was just telling me all about American politics. I had a friend who is Colombian, and I was asking her, what does she think about American politics earlier in the year? And she was like, this is the one electoral office that we believe that the whole world should be able to vote for, because the president of the United States impacts the entire world. Just to give you some context, so even when you go deep, deep into rural areas in Africa, you will find that maybe one person, a couple of families, has a television, has a radio, and everybody will crowd around the television to watch. Everyone will crowd around the radio to listen. I've seen this in rural areas, in commercial areas, at night, in Zanzibar even. At night, someone will bring out a TV and other people will just come and sit in front of the TV and watch the nightly news, national and international. So they are typically more informed about international events because they know that what happens in the outside world will definitely impact them. Africans are multiracial. That whole situation with Tyla is colored in South Africa. Okay, she would be considered a bastard in Namibia. I have a problem with that term, but there are very proud bastards in Namibia. That is a term for people who are both Black and white. We all know that racism, or not racism, but race is it's a human construct. It's not rooted in anything biological, but we're going to use that term race, for example. Africans are multiracial. One of my favorites go-to restaurants for Asian cuisine is Dragon Eye in Nairobi, and it is run by a family from Hong Kong. They've been in Kenya for about 3 or 4 generations. They're from Hong Kong. They serve Hong Kong street food. It's delicious. You should check it out. Now, this might shock you based on the imaging that is put out into the world about Africans. They are predominantly Christian and Muslim, okay? Different sects of Christianity and Islam. However, they are predominantly Christian and Muslim. Most Africans are not animists. Animists, in school, we learned animists were basically people who practice traditional religions. I don't know who came up with that term. It almost sounds like animal worship. But one would think, based upon the media that is put out there about Africans, that they're into traditional spirituality, that they're into witchcraft. It's interesting and it's nuanced because I liken it to my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who is Creole from New Orleans, Louisiana. He will tell you to your face, he don't believe in voodoo. He don't believe in witchcraft, but he's afraid of it. You know what I'm saying? How are you afraid of something you don't believe in? And I find that that's the case with many Africans. It's like, oh, we don't believe in that. We don't practice that. However, when the shit hits the fan, when there's a problem that the doctor can't work out, when there's a problem that prayer is not seeming to rectify, they may just slide over to the traditional healer, to somebody who deals with things that can't be seen. Now, this might shock you. Africans, for the most part, do not see themselves as Black. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nigerian author, she's written quite a bit about this. They define themselves by their ethnic group or tribe. Tribe somehow is often only reserved for Africans. A lot of people have problems with using the word tribe, but we'll say ethnic group, their clan, their gender. Like Black is really not on the lists as far as this is how we self-identify. Now, when people leave the continent, that's when they're defined as Black by others. I just was going back and forth with somebody in the comments on a previous episode, and she was basically like, leave that racial stuff away from Africa. We do not define ourselves as Black. We are not Black. And I'm like, for the sake of argument, if I'm talking about a multiracial Africa, I'm going to describe you as Black collectively. Black is a label that was put on us by outsiders. Africans grew up with domestic help. Unlike us Unlike us poor Americans that grew up waking up on Saturdays and everybody had a chore, okay? Mine was vacuuming the house. So it's really interesting because you may find that your housekeeper has a housekeeper. You know what I'm saying? You may find that your nanny has a nanny. You have Africans that grew up with domestic help and they're accustomed to having things done for them. Some people have a certain level of entitlement that Americans may find problematic, and they have a certain view of house help, of servants, because they grew up with house help, with guards, with drivers, with a nanny, with a housekeeper. You see what I'm saying? Africans are among the shortest and the tallest people in the world. I hired a man who was from the Batwa community in Rwanda to shoot one of my episodes about fashion off the beaten path. And then you've also got the Dinka on the other end. Dinka are predominantly in South Sudan, but due to political, social, economic strife, you'll find Dinka all over the world. And if you don't know what a Dinka looks like, just go back to the runway. Like the runway is just, I want to say, dominated by people who are Dinka. Just there's no other people on the planet that look like them. Extremely tall, usually on average, 5'11". That's on average, including men and women, okay? And typically very dark and just thin. Model recruits, designers love working with Dinka. I even have worked with Dinka on a shoot I did in Uganda. Next to the Dinka would be the Tutsi. Those people are predominantly based in Rwanda, though, given the political, economic, and social situation in Rwanda, you can find Tutsi all over the world. I even stayed with a family through Airbnb in Kigali, Rwanda, and the youngest daughter, she was just set, hell bent, focused on becoming a model, and she made it. Sis is just, she's bad. So within the continent of Africa, we have the shortest people in the world as well as the tallest people in the world. Everybody in Africa is not very dark skinned or on the darker end of the spectrum. It really just depends on where you are, which ethnic group. I'm currently in Kenya. And so I would say in Kenya, amongst the ethnic groups, Kikuyu are known to be some of the lighter people within Kenya. However, you can find lighter and very dark-skinned people throughout the country, just depending upon their family history, their family lineage. You deserve to live in peace. You deserve a life free from dirty politics, violence, and constant stress. We offer 360-degree relocation services, from personal concierge support to full relocation packages, to help you build the life you've been dreaming of here in Kenya. Purchase your relocation service today at beautyisuniversal.com and take your first step toward a softer, freer life. More details are waiting for you in the description. You might be shocked to find out that a lot of Africans really don't know concretely their family history. For a while, I was into watching these African DNA reveals, Ethiopian, Kenyan, and it was a shock to me that people were shocked to find out that they had DNA or genetic connection to people outside of Africa. For instance, Ethiopians shocked that they had lineage in Italy or Greece or India. Kenyan shocked that they had lineage in or genetic connection to people in India or the UK. And I'm like, do y'all not know your history? So that's one of the issues, is that in many school systems within Africa, they're not learning about their own history. They're learning about their colonizers' history. That's one. Number two, slavery is not new to Africa. Chattel slavery is not something that Africans practice. However, slavery in general, prisoners of war, etc., like that, it was a real thing. And so if you were a prisoner of war, then you would take on the culture of the people who captured you. There's also a history of women being kidnapped. This is still happening in some parts of Africa, where women are kidnapped by men and then they marry into a different ethnic group, and then they take on the culture of their husband, teaching their children the culture of their husband. And then there's also enslavement. One of the things that's been interesting for me is just realizing, like, okay, so y'all don't know because it's not taught. Even in a place like Zanzibar, which was first populated by Tanzanian fishermen from the mainland, who eventually started to populate the island, bring over their wives, right? But then because it's along the East African coast, there were so many groups of people from India, from Persia, from China, even from the Arab world, that literally were involved in the slave trade. Don't nobody hop in my comments telling me the Chinese were not involved in the slave trade. They were. So what you find out when you go to the Slavery Museum in Zanzibar is people were brought from as far west as Cameroon to work along the coast of Africa, as well as be transported to the Arab world, to the Asian world, to Asia to work. But when you speak to Zenjis about this history, they will tell you it's a lie and they ain't never heard of it because they didn't learn about it. I had one friend even go so far as to tell me that it's propaganda designed to drive a wedge between the Black Zenjis and the Arabs on the island. Honestly, a lot of people do not know about their family lineage. They can look up and see that maybe their family is very different in appearance than other members of their ethnic group, and they will not know the reason why. They won't be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Africans is some polyglots. I mean, fluent, damn near fluent in multiple languages. They'll know the lingua franca, which wherever that is. In Kenya, it would be English, Kiswahili. This is the lingua franca here, right? But then they'll also know their mother tongue, their father's tongue, their neighbor's language. And because so many upper class Africans are so well traveled, they'll know multiple languages beyond the continent. And oh my gosh, just meet somebody that works in tourism, somebody who may only have a high school education. They will know the language of all the tourists that come to their destination: Italian, French, German, Japanese, Chinese, English. Polyglots. Africans are also very classist. It might surprise you to know. This is honestly, it's going to depend on the person and also the country as well. I find that Tanzanians are less classist than other East Africans. For example, the word they use for housekeeper in Tanzania is dada. Dada means sister in Kiswahili. So somebody might ask you, do you have a dada? Do you need a dada? Can your dada help you? So just the term of calling someone my sister, dada, sister, can you help me? That frames it up for you. One of the things that used to simultaneously tickle me and irritate me in Tanzania is how I could be having a heated discussion or negotiation with a taxi driver. And then other Tanzanians would just come over. They'll stand around and they'll be listening, and then they'll interject. And it's like, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you. But they have to add their 2 cents. And I think that lends to how they're not a very classist people, and also to the history of Julius Nyerere, the socialism, borderline, we'll just say socialism. Tanzania was on that trajectory for a minute. But then you have other parts of Africa, different ethnic groups that are very classist. And I tend to find that amongst people that actually descend from kingdoms. Not all African nations or not all ethnic groups had kingdoms. I tend to find that people are more classist when they descend from a nation of kingdoms. Because within these kingdoms, you have clans, and each clan has their own positioning. It might surprise you to know that Africans can be quite classist. Africans are also texturists. The type of hair you got, is it more proximate to African? Is it less proximate to African? For when I had long hair, I was going to an Ethiopian salon here in Nairobi. And, first thing they did was go through my hair, and they're like, oh, you have really nice hair. I'm like, okay, thank you. As a Black person, I know the subtext, right? So what happened next was like, oh, your hair is not like the Kenyans' hair, as in it's nicer than the Kenyan hair, right? And so I was like, okay, just do my hair. And then I brought in a guest, an African American guest. She had a looser curl and a larger curl diameter. Oh my God, they was loving on her hair. Oh my gosh, your hair is so nice. And so afterwards, I went back to get my hair done, and they were just asking me, like, where she was from, and is she Somali? Is she Ethiopian? I'm like, no, she's African American. Yeah, Africans can be texturists for real. I'm just gonna leave that right there. This is a generalization that is generally true. For Africans, time is cyclical. Okay. I was invited to a party recently, and they told us to get there at 7 because they know they people. So me and my girlfriend show up, and we the first people there. I said, you gave us the African time. The co-host said, listen, I know what time to give certain people because we need y'all out of here by midnight. Okay. And sure enough, most of the attendees were African, arriving well after 7 p.m. Okay. 10 o'clock, 11 folks are still coming in. I lay all of that on the table for you to realize Africans are human. Africans are complex. They're multi-layered. There is so much beyond what you see. Whenever I hear somebody, Black, white, Asian, Latin, whenever I hear somebody say, oh, they're so happy with the little that they have, I just cringe because there's the mask, and then there's so much more beyond the mask. Thank you for joining me on this episode of BLAXIT to Africa. If you like what you heard, please share, subscribe, and leave a comment. May you thrive. May you be inspired. May you move with love and intention. Until next time.